Throughout NBA history, you can find a lot of interesting things. There's a lot of conspiracies out there. There's a lot of what ifs. What if this had happened? What if this trade had or hadn't been made? But one thing that you don't really find, especially in comparison to something like baseball here in the US, is cheating. Teams typically don't cheat. There's not a lot of performance enhancing issues in the NBA. But the one thing that they've just never been able to figure out, something that dramatically impacts teams going to the finals, making conference finals runs, where teams end up in the league, where players end up, is tampering. It's something the league has never been able to figure out, and it is once again in the news, with the Knicks losing a second-round pick as a result of a tampering investigation by the league. Now, in order to fully understand what's happening here and how these teams are basically cheating and the league is letting them get away with it, you have to fully understand what tampering is. And essentially, by definition, tampering is any member of an organization, player, staff, ownership, trying to lure a player that is on a different team at the time to their team, whether it be in free agency, whether it be pushing them to request a trade. It's something that we have seen continually, right? Like player movement is a big thing in this era of the NBA, and tampering is a big part of that. And if you are, for example, the LA Lakers, and you're talking to Anthony Davis through these back channels about, hey, you could request a trade, or if you're, as we're learning about right now, the Houston Rockets, maybe putting a bug in James Harden's ear about possibly returning to Houston this offseason via free agency. If you're doing that and you're a member of the organization, that is illegal, it's cheating, and it is tampering. It is something that we have seen multiple examples of over the past couple of seasons, and it's something the league is attempting to fix, but not really doing a very good job of. So in terms of some recent examples that we've seen in the league, whether it be via a sign and trade or a player in free agency, things that the league investigated. Kyle Lowry going to Miami was something they investigated. He comes from Toronto, but that was part of a sign and trade, and they negotiated a deal with him really quickly in the process of getting him, and it became clear that they probably had conversations before actually making the deal. Anytime you're able to sign a guy to a contract that quickly. Also, Bogdanovich to Milwaukee, the summer that they traded for Drew Holiday, that trade was supposed to go through as well. They got punished for that. Lonzo to Chicago was also investigated, and then PJ Tucker to Philly this past offseason, which had a lot of things to deal with there, whether it be James Harden taking a salary cut, PJ Tucker going to Philadelphia. Those are just a handful of recent examples. And there's two different things to really account for when you're talking about tampering with these teams. One is you're talking to a player. For example, I talked about earlier, Anthony Davis going to the Lakers. It was very clear that, whether it be Clutch or members of the Lakers organization, a lot of times those two things are connected. They were actively recruiting Anthony Davis to request a trade to end up with the Lakers, telling him about how much better it would be to be in LA and to be in that market. And a lot of that not only led to him requesting the trade, but it really upset members of the Pelicans front office and organization for obvious reasons. So you have that, and then you have something that we see every single year. Think about every year when you're paying attention to NBA free agency. It starts at 6 o'clock Eastern time, and at 6:01, you've got 10 deals signed immediately. You have all these players that have signed, $100 million plus contracts as soon as free agency is supposed to start. And you're not technically supposed to begin negotiating these deals until that 6 o'clock number. There's supposed to be, a ban on negotiation in the weeks prior to that free agency period. And so obviously, if teams already know who they're signing and players already know what they're signing for, there's something happening here. And this is an issue for a handful of reasons. One, let's just say, for example, you're one of these teams around the league that looks at this and says, you know what, let's abide by the rules. I don't want to get caught, tampering. Teams are losing second round picks. I don't want to do that. So you wait until 6 o'clock to negotiate with free agents, or you don't interfere with other teams, best players trying to get them to request a trade. Well, it's one of those things where other teams in the league are going to. The Lakers are going to. The Knicks are going to. Teams like this that have the opportunity to push, players towards their market, they're going to. So already, even if you choose to abide by this, you're behind the 8 ball. And yes, the Knicks might lose on a second round pick, but as we're going to talk about later, that's not really that big of a deal for them. And then the other part of this, of course, is just that the league has to have an understanding of how to regulate this and how to enforce these rules, because then at that point, what's the point of having the rule if everybody is just going against it? It's a big issue because it is something that is more beneficial to these bigger market teams. That's something the NBA, especially in the modern era, has tried to be very aware of and make sure there's not a ton of advantages for being the Lakers or for being the Knicks. They don't want these teams to have a huge advantage. They're already going to have some of an advantage with those markets, but not too much of an advantage over these smaller market teams, which brings me to what's been the biggest issue with tampering the entire time that it's been a thing in this modern era. It's always kind of been a thing, but more recently, certainly it's been a bigger issue. And that is, how do you enforce this? You can, for the last couple of years, you can be the NBA and you can say, hey, we're going to crack down on this. Don't tamper. Don't do it. Don't talk to other teams' players. Don't try and force them to come to your team. Don't talk to them early in free agency. Don't do it, which they've done a better job of over the last couple of seasons. A couple of years ago, they passed some new rules. They put more of an emphasis on making sure that this wasn't as big of a deal. But for example, like if you're the Knicks and they're like, hey, you talked to Jalen Brunson a little bit too early for free agency, we're going to take away a second round pick. The Knicks have like 10 more first round picks over the next second round picks, over the next 7 years. It doesn't matter to them. You can take away a second round pick. They're still going to go out and do this all over again. But then on the other hand, if you are one of these teams and everybody's doing it and you're just involved in it because it's just what everybody else is doing, it kind of feels like taking away a first round pick maybe is a little bit too much of a punishment. And at that point, it's more about, I don't think teams are going to stop. They're just going to do a much better job of not getting caught. And that's something they've gotten much better at, because even if it's not a direct member of the organization, for example, the Lakers, they could have members of Clutch or this guy's buddy or this back channel say, hey, LeBron, we really like to play with you in LA. There's all these benefits. Like, we can take care of you if you sign with us as your agency, and then a years and years long process of getting Anthony Davis to the Lakers. That's something that's really difficult to regulate in the league, for the league. And if you start taking away first round picks, you need to really make sure you're getting this stuff right. So to me, taking away first round picks, I don't really think is the answer here. And I'm interested to see what you guys have to say down in the comment section below in terms of what you think the league should do to try and mitigate this and take this away. But one idea that I thought was interesting that I've been seeing floating around is, what if you just rewarded the team that lost the player in free agency, regardless of tampering or this and that? Like, you want to lock that down. You want to make sure that, maybe you can continue to keep that second round price, right? Like, let's just say that you're, if you're the Knicks, you still lose your second round pick because you got caught tampering. But if you're Dallas, maybe you get like a compensatory, maybe the 31st pick in the draft suddenly is yours. Like, maybe you just get an extra first round pick at the back half of the first round. This is something that the NFL, for example, does when you sign away a big free agent. The team that loses that player gets a compensatory pick. It's not a first round pick in the NFL to be way too valuable, but for the NBA, it wouldn't be that big of a deal to give them, the 31st pick or all the way up to 35. However many teams lose free agents, you can have like a scale in terms of, how much you get in return for the value of each player. It would kind of intertwine with what you could potentially get via trade. And that's an interesting idea. My one issue with that is the thing that makes the NBA so exciting and so interesting for so many modern fans right now is the player movement. It is the trades, and it is the free agency and the constant news cycle that creates. And if you start adding compensatory picks in, or you start taking away too many picks from teams that are maybe, getting ahead of themselves here in terms of tampering, and if you start to mitigate the thing that for a lot of people makes the NBA most interesting, that ultimately is not a good idea in the long term for the league. Which leads me to where I've ultimately landed on this tampering stuff, and that is, unfortunately, I think things are probably just going to stay the way that they are. And I say unfortunately because that gap that we talked about between these bigger market teams and these smaller market teams is just going to continue to be there. Like, it's unfortunate for those smaller market teams, but the NBA is going to look at the situation and realize that big time players in star markets in New York and LA and Chicago, that's better for us. Like, yeah, we can make sure that we're, looking at tampering and taking away a second round pick here or there to show that we're actually enforcing this. But ultimately, if it leads to more big time players and more big time markets, that's better for the league. And there's no real way for them to enforce this without, as I mentioned in the last section, taking away or mitigating a little bit of what makes the NBA so interesting right now for the modern fan, which is why I'm so interested in, down in the comment section below, for you guys to tell me what you think the league should do about this, because to me, it's almost an unsolvable issue, at least in a way that would positively impact the league. This isn't something that you should just try and get rid of for the sake of getting rid of it. It should increase the experience, or improve the experience, I should say, for the fans. And I'm not sure that it would do that except for case by case, for these particular smaller market teams. And it's a really interesting kind of comparison between, in general, you would think if teams around the league are cheating, as they pretty much are when it comes to this tampering stuff, the league would want to get rid of that. Yeah, I'm not actually sure that's the case. And you can talk about, rule changes and different things that, could maybe improve the situation, but ultimately, this is kind of part of the fabric of what the league is right now. But like, when you think about the random Christmas Day James Harden to the Rockets rumor, like, that more than likely is something where, one, ESPN wants to get people's attention on Christmas Day. They've got all the games, and that's a great way to do it that morning. But also, like, James Harden's people in Philadelphia could float that rumor out so that Philly makes sure that they lock him down long term. He gave up money this past offseason, gave up long-term security this past offseason, presumably. And if they want a 5-year max this offseason, a great way to do that was to make sure that there are other threats. Houston has the most cap space in the league this upcoming offseason, and there are obviously connections there between Harden and Houston. And if you float that out there, then you're probably going to get a better deal if ultimately Philly wants to re-sign Harden, and then things just continue to go in a circle. And when you're that far in, when you've allowed something for this long and it's become such a big part of the league, it's really, really difficult to reel that back in a way that makes sense, in a way that actually improves the league. And ultimately, I think that's where we're going to be. Like, not that, the league is full of cheating and tampering, but it does happen a lot. And it's something that teams have used for so long that it would be really, really difficult not only to regulate, but I'm not sure that it would make a ton of sense to either. Now, having said that, the one rule change that I think they absolutely need to make is this weird, like, ban on communicating with players leading up to free agency or negotiating contracts or signing deals, whatever the case may be. That to me doesn't really make any sense. Like, everybody in the league, all 30 teams in the league, whether it be secretly or otherwise, are talking to players leading up to free agency at 6 o'clock Eastern on whatever day that it is. Like, just allow them to do that, once the season's over. Set a date that makes sense as soon as the season's over, where everybody's season is done. And just that to me is the one that is completely nonsensical. Like, everybody else is doing it. Everybody knows that everybody else is doing it, to the point where you have to, in order to kind of keep pace. And if we're going to continue to keep this facade where it's like, oh, Lonzo and the Bulls agreed to a deal 1 minute after free agency started, I don't really think that makes a ton of sense. I think it's just silly, quite frankly. That's a rule we can get rid of. But overall, if you think that tampering is cheating, you think it's bad for the league, I do think that it's probably here to stay.